They said I was overreacting when I left halfway through the dinner. But if you'd heard what my mother whispered to me right before dessert, I promise you wouldn't have stayed seated either. My name is Olivia Mitchell. I'm 32 years old. And for most of my adult life, I've lived under a shadow that my own family carved out for me with surgical precision. That shadow was shaped like my younger brother Ethan, smart, successful, and forever loyal to our parents' expectations. I, on the other hand, was the storm they never stopped bracing for. They call me the one who ran. What they never mention is what I was running from. Tonight, I sat at Ethan's engagement dinner, smiling through clinked wine glasses and syrupy toasts, a guest at a table where I used to belong. Everyone said I looked elegant. Controlled. It was easy to look composed when you spent years practicing your expressions in mirrors, just so nobody could accuse you of being dramatic. When my parents invited me to the dinner, it was phrased as an afterthought. "We assume you'll be free," my mother had said, with the sort of tone you use when you're informing the cleaning service what time to arrive. My RSVP had been a quiet yes, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to see for myself how far the rot had spread. The engagement dinner was held in a private room at Latelier, a place where you could smell the Michelin stars in the air. Ethan's fiancée, Julia, is lovely in that polished, corporate way. She wore a cream-colored sheath dress that whispered old money. I wore navy, modest heels, and a neutral lip, nothing flashy, nothing worth comment. Not that it helped. The moment I walked in, my mother's eyes scanned me like a TSA agent looking for weapons. "You made it," she said, her voice tight with surprise, as if she had bet money I'd flake. "Hope you're staying out of trouble this time." And just like that, the tone was set. I took a seat near the end of the table, just close enough to hear the conversations but far enough that no one would bother pretending I was central to the evening. I watched Ethan laughing with our father, his arm slung casually over Julia's chair. My mother was already recounting a story from Ethan's med school days to Julia's parents, who nodded politely while sipping a 2006 Bordeaux. My existence, apparently, was not relevant to the narrative of the evening. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, fingers steady, heart calm. I hadn't come to pick a fight. I hadn't come to reclaim lost ground. I just wanted to witness. To remember. To understand what it felt like to be so thoroughly, deliberately edited out of your own life. When the main course arrived, herb-crusted lamb, truffle risotto, seasonal greens, I noticed how easily the conversation flowed without ever touching on me. Nobody asked what I did for work now. Nobody mentioned the app acquisition I'd read about in TechCrunch last month. Nobody cared that I'd rebuilt everything from the ground up after leaving the family's preferred path. In their eyes, I was still the girl who dropped out of med school after my second year. The one who couldn't handle the pressure. The one who got lost in California, as my aunt once put it during Christmas brunch while I was sitting 3 feet away. What they never acknowledged was that I left med school after a breakdown so severe I could barely eat. That I clawed my way back to stability alone, with no help from the people who were too busy being disappointed in me. That I'd founded a tech company, sold it for 7 figures, and was now quietly funding mental health programs for young women in STEM. But none of that mattered. Not in this room. Not to them. Halfway through dessert, Julia raised her glass for a toast. Her voice was warm, rehearsed, but genuine. To Ethan, the man who makes everyone feel seen. To love, to family, and to new beginnings. Everyone clinked their glasses. My mother leaned in toward me with a smile as sharp as glass. "See, Olivia? This is how it's done. No drama, no dropping out, no running away." The clink of my fork on the dessert plate was deafening in my ears. I didn't respond. I just set the fork down and excused myself. Calm. Measured. Still polite, even in retreat. I made it as far as the marble-floored hallway before my legs began to shake. This isn't the full story. This is just the match. The fire is coming. You know what it's like to be erased in real time? It doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens in whispers, in omissions, In the way people forget to say your name while still talking about you. I sat in my car after Ethan's engagement dinner with the engine off and the overhead light still on, the silence inside heavier than the jazz murmuring from the restaurant behind me. My hand was still on the steering wheel, knuckles stiff, nails biting into my palm not from fear, but from the brutal act of restraint. That dinner hadn't broken me, but it had pressed harder on bruises that never fully healed. I didn't leave the dinner because of the toast or the food or even my mother's latest passive-aggressive dig. I left because for the 5th time in as many years, I realized that my family hadn't just moved on without me, they had rewritten the story, and in their version, I was never really in it to begin with. Years ago, after I walked away from my medical program at Johns Hopkins, the narrative was drafted and distributed before I even got back to my apartment. I know this because by the time I called my aunt to explain, guilt heavy in my throat, trying to justify a decision that nearly killed me, she already knew. At least, she thought she did. "Oh sweetheart, we all heard what happened. Your mom said you just couldn't handle the pressure. That it got too overwhelming." Her voice was cloyingly sweet, the kind used for lost pets and disappointing grades. I remember gripping the phone tighter and staring at the hairline crack in my bedroom mirror. "That's not what happened," I said, my voice brittle with disbelief. "Well," she replied after a long pause, "I'm sure it felt like the right decision for you." It didn't matter what the truth was. My family had already told a better story. They didn't mention that I'd been working 60-hour weeks under a mentor who once told me, with a smirk, that women like you don't last long here. They didn't include the panic attacks that made my vision blur mid-surgery. They certainly didn't bring up how I sat alone on a campus bench one night, phone in hand, considering dialing a crisis line, before deciding to call no one. When I withdrew from the program, I submitted formal documentation to the school, followed all the steps, made sure it was clean and procedural. I even wrote a letter to the department chair thanking them for the opportunity. I told my parents I needed a break to reassess, to breathe, to survive. My mother responded with a 3-word text, "I'm disappointed, Olivia." My father called once, but it wasn't to ask if I was okay. He just wanted to make sure I returned the tuition refund to their account. That was the last month they sent me money. That was the last time they used the word proud. By the holidays, the version of me that existed in family group chats had been boiled down to an uncomfortable footnote. She's figuring things out. She's taking time for herself. She's doing something with computers now, I think. They never said the word burnout. They never acknowledged the breakdown. They said I quit. What they never told anyone, what I still can't believe sometimes, is how they actually laughed when I called to say I was moving to San Diego. "You're running away to California?" my father asked, voice echoing through the Bluetooth speaker in the family room where I used to play piano as a kid. "Are you joining a commune or just finally embracing your flakiness?" My mother chimed in from the background, her voice dry as ever. "Well, at least the weather will be nice while she fails." They had cut me off and then mocked the consequences of it, as if struggling to pay rent or skipping meals was some kind of punishment they could snicker over at brunch. They wanted me to crawl back. They wanted me to beg. When I didn't, they rewrote that too. Told people I was too proud to ask for help. That I was making things harder than they had to be. I wasn't proud. I was just done. In San Diego, I worked 3 jobs while finishing my degree online. I coded at night in coffee shops that smelled like burnt beans and tired dreams. I shared a 1-bedroom with 2 other girls, both running from something, neither willing to talk about it. We survived on discounted groceries and second-hand furniture and the shared understanding that nobody was coming to save us. That was the year I started building what would eventually become my own company, though, of course, my family doesn't know that. They think I drifted. They think I settled. What I actually did was build something so private, so stable, so undeniably mine that I no longer had to explain myself to anyone. That's the part that stings the most, how they never even tried to ask. How in all these years, not a single one of them reached out with genuine curiosity. My parents know what Ethan does in exquisite detail, what lab he's managing, who's sponsoring his research, how many papers he's published. They know nothing about me, because they never cared to know. Once, when Ethan and I were still close, he called to check in, his voice unusually soft. "You know they don't mean to be like that," he said, trying to play peacemaker the way he always did. "They just don't know how to connect with your choices." I wanted to scream. Choices? Like I had chosen to fall apart under the weight of expectation. Like I had chosen to be dissected at family dinners, measured against Ethan's shadow until I bled. "They don't ask, Ethan." "They don't even ask," I said, my voice shaking, "and I've stopped giving them chances to." He didn't respond. Just sighed and changed the subject. Now, when I see Ethan, it's with the cautious detachment of someone observing a ghost. The love is still there, buried under 1,000 small betrayals and the knowledge that he never once defended me. Not out loud. Not in the ways that mattered. He still calls me sis when he texts. Still sends generic birthday wishes. Still lives in a world where I am the family eccentric, not the family survivor. I don't invite them into my life anymore. They don't know I live in a mid-century house tucked into the hills above San Diego, with wide glass windows that catch every inch of morning light. They don't know about my dog, Max, or the weekends I spend volunteering at coding boot camps for girls who remind me of the girl I used to be, brilliant, scared, underestimated. They don't know I run a company that just secured its third round of funding. They don't know I'm featured in industry panels or that a startup I quietly advised got acquired by Google last spring. They don't know because they never asked. And I stopped waiting for them to. So when I sat at that dinner tonight, watching my mother beam at Julia like she was some prize-winning show horse, I didn't feel jealousy. I felt clarity. Julia will never disappoint them the way I did, because she never dared to be different in the first place. As I drove away, the lights of Late Lear shrinking in my rearview mirror, I didn't cry. I didn't grip the wheel like I used to, rage pulsing through my fingertips. I just drove. Calm. Focused. Like someone finally seeing the road ahead. Because here's the truth they'll never say aloud, the one that haunts every room I enter: they needed someone to cast out. Not because I failed, but because I refused to fail the way they preferred. And I think deep down, they always feared what I might become if I ever got the chance to grow outside their design. You can spend years trying to forget the way a room tilts when you walk in, the way conversations reroute themselves around your presence like a river avoiding a fallen branch, and then one stranger can say your name and tilt the whole room back in your direction. I wasn't going to go to the dinner. After the last one, after my mother's performative smile and my father's faintly annoyed handshake, I told myself I'd done my time. I had smiled enough, bitten my tongue hard enough, swallowed enough bitter wine and tepid compliments to earn a permanent reprieve. But the invitation came anyway, printed on thick ivory cardstock, addressed to me in my full name, which meant either my mother was trying to appear classy or Julia was handling the logistics now. It was Ethan's second engagement celebration, this one a formal dinner with extended family, colleagues, and friends of the bride. A pre-wedding event to prove everyone still liked each other, that the union wasn't just strategic or expected but somehow heartfelt. And despite every instinct telling me not to show, I showed. Not because I wanted their approval, those years were long gone, but because curiosity had its own gravitational pull, and some small part of me wanted to see what had become of the people who once tried so hard to forget I existed. I arrived 15 minutes late, not on purpose, but not by accident either. I walked in through the side entrance of the private hall rented for the event, immediately enveloped in the scent of citrus blossoms and overpriced champagne. The room was warm, humming with expensive laughter. Crystalline lights dangled from the ceiling like a frozen waterfall, and every table gleamed with polished silverware and custom-printed menus. The kind of place meant to impress, to say look at us, we are a family worth celebrating. Nobody noticed my arrival at first. I slipped into the seat at the far end of the long banquet table, the one closest to the wall, where servers could move past without jostling the more important guests. It wasn't assigned to me, of course, but it was empty, and I had no illusions about where they'd prefer I sit. From my end of the table, I could see Ethan in his tailored navy suit, Julia glowing beside him like an ad for luxury skincare, her laughter effortless and always timed to someone else's joke. My parents sat only a few chairs down from them, their posture rigid with practiced dignity, their expressions neutral as if they were both waiting for someone to misstep. They hadn't seen me yet, or they had and had chosen to ignore it. Either scenario made perfect sense. I listened quietly as a series of toasts began, one after another, each more effusive than the last. Ethan's college roommate reminisced about their late-night study sessions. His mentor from med school spoke in glowing terms about Ethan's unshakable discipline and innate brilliance. Julia's father, a retired corporate executive, toasted to their shared values and impressive future. No one mentioned the bride's mother, though her absence hung thick in the air like a missing painting in a gallery wall. I didn't eat much. I pushed the saffron risotto around my plate and sipped water, not wine. The pattern of these events was predictable: smiles, backpats, applause, silence. It always ended in silence when it came to me. So I stayed still, content to exist on the periphery of the evening, invisible but not unobservant. Then it happened. Maya, Julia's cousin, blonde, elegant, seated beside me out of polite obligation or last-minute reshuffling, leaned in with the warmth of someone who hadn't yet been warned about me. "I'm sorry," she said, in that casual dinner party tone people use when trying to bridge awkwardness. "I don't think we've met." "I'm Maya." I smiled politely, set down my fork. "Olivia." She tilted her head. "Olivia." I hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then I said it. Not because I wanted to make a point. Just because it was true. "Olivia Reed." Her expression shifted immediately, not to confusion or disinterest, but something much sharper. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if she'd just remembered something crucial. Her eyes widened just enough for me to notice. "Wait," she said, louder than she meant to. "Wait, you're Olivia Reed? As in Reed Tech? The algorithm project from the Center for Responsible AI?" And just like that, the air changed. The volume of the room didn't drop immediately, but something about the way her voice cut through the ambient music and clinking glasses drew eyes. First Julia turned, then Ethan, then one of my cousins, then both parents. A fork dropped somewhere. A server paused mid-step. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. It was the collective breath of people recalibrating everything they thought they knew. I blinked, unsure of how to respond. I nodded once, carefully. "Yes," I said, quietly but clearly. "That's me." Maya's mouth fell open again. "I read about your audit protocol in Wired last year. It's revolutionary. Our compliance team uses your open-source integrity scanner to flag racial bias in data sets." "You're the Olivia Reed?" Now the silence was total. Across the table, my mother's wine glass tilted ever so slightly. My father's posture had stiffened into a statue's. Ethan looked like someone had swapped his dessert with a live grenade. "I had no idea you were related to Ethan," Maya continued, her voice now echoing across a room that had completely turned in on itself. "Julia never mentioned, wait, I'm sorry, this is wild. You were just featured on that panel with, oh God, what's her name, the woman from Stanford's ethics lab?" My lips parted, and I laughed once, not out of joy but in disbelief. "Dr. Chen," I supplied, my voice now steady. "Yeah, we work together sometimes." It was Ethan who spoke next, his voice uncertain and uneven. You're that Olivia Reed?" I turned my head slowly toward him. For once, his confident, polished tone was gone. He looked at me like someone seeing a stranger in their own family photo. I gave him a single nod. "Apparently so." Julia stared at Ethan, then at me, then back at him. "Why didn't you ever tell me she was that Olivia?" she asked, bewildered. "You said she worked in tech, not that she invented half the damn trust protocols my company uses." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. My father cleared his throat. "You never said," he began, eyes darting between me and the rest of the stunned table, "that you were doing anything like that." No, I said, folding my napkin and placing it beside my plate, you never asked. There it was. The moment I realized they weren't just surprised, they were embarrassed. They hadn't just underestimated me, they had discarded me. And now, here I was, standing in the very space they had reserved for disappointment, being praised in front of their colleagues by a stranger they desperately wanted to impress. Someone at the table, a cousin maybe, or one of Julia's uncles, whispered something that sounded like, "I use her code in my research." Someone else nodded. Another fork dropped. A wine glass tipped. Maya, oblivious to the shockwaves she'd just unleashed, leaned closer. "You gave that talk at the MIT ethics conference last fall, right?" I was in the back row. I literally took notes on everything you said. I smiled then, not because I needed her praise, but because it was the first time in years someone in my family saw me through a lens I had crafted entirely on my own. Across from me, my mother blinked slowly, her lips forming a question she wouldn't dare speak aloud. My father's mouth was a thin line. Ethan stared down at his plate, jaw clenched. The power wasn't in the recognition, it was in the reversal. For the first time, they were the ones scrambling to redefine me. And I was just eating dinner. You don't need applause to feel seen. Sometimes it's just one voice, breaking through a wall of curated silence, that finally tells you, you were never invisible, you were just being ignored. Maya was still leaning toward me, her face glowing with the unmistakable thrill of realizing she had been seated next to someone she admired without even knowing it. Her excitement wasn't performative or exaggerated, it was the genuine enthusiasm of a woman who had engaged with my work from a distance, never once imagining that the person responsible for the protocol she used daily would be sitting beside her at a family dinner she had almost skipped. "I can't believe this," she said again, shaking her head like the realization was still unraveling in real time. "We read your papers in grad school. Your adaptive ethics model was a case study in our data science ethics seminar. Your white paper on algorithmic fairness literally changed the way we approached our hiring platform. And that TED Talk? I mean, it went around our entire office. My boss made us all watch it at our quarterly strategy session." Her voice was carrying across the table now, bright and unfiltered, and I could feel the shift in the room like a ripple against my skin. This was not the kind of praise my family was used to hearing directed toward me. Not the kind of impact they had ever associated with the daughter they'd labeled as lost. I heard the whispering begin before I saw where it was coming from. To my left, an older cousin leaned into his wife, murmuring something that ended in the word founder. Across the table, one of my uncles, whose only prior conversations with me involved asking why I looked tired or what happened to that promising pre-med thing, was now squinting at me like I had sprouted a second head. Even the server paused slightly as she passed behind me, her tray momentarily forgotten in her hands. My father was the first to attempt damage control. He let out a laugh that tried to sound casual but landed somewhere between startled and artificial. "Well," he said, raising his glass halfway, "seems like Olivia's been busier than we realized." It was the kind of line meant to dismiss and reframe simultaneously. The kind that says let's acknowledge this just enough to neutralize it, while gently steering the conversation back toward safer, more familiar ground. But the air in the room had already changed. The tension wasn't going anywhere. And the weight of silence now pressed squarely onto my mother's shoulders. She had always been the master of subtle control, an arched eyebrow, a tightened jaw, a perfectly timed sip of wine that signaled disapproval without requiring a single word. But tonight, she was quiet. Pale. Her perfectly manicured hand gripped the stem of her glass with such stillness that I wondered if she even remembered she was holding it. She didn't know what to say. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to fill that silence for her. I turned back to Maya and nodded once, slowly. "Yeah," I said, my voice calm and without performative humility. "That's me." The simplicity of the statement was intentional. I wasn't looking for validation, not anymore. I wasn't trying to prove anything to the people at this table who had spent years shaping a narrative that excluded me. I was just stating a fact. A truth that had existed long before they acknowledged it. Ethan, seated further down near Julia, was frozen mid-sip. His glass hovered an inch from his lips, forgotten. He looked at me with wide, stunned eyes, the expression of a man watching the floor shift beneath him. This wasn't a revelation he had prepared for. This wasn't a moment he could spin into a joke or a memory. This was a truth he hadn't known about his own sister. "Wait," he finally said, blinking as if trying to reboot. "You founded Reed Tech?" "That's, Jesus, Liv, why didn't you ever?" He didn't finish the sentence. Because whatever he had been about to say would have been hollow. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" "Because you never asked." "Why didn't you ever bring it up?" "Because you were too busy measuring me against your own metrics to notice I was building something you couldn't even comprehend." I met his gaze, not with anger, but with clarity. "It just never came up," I said quietly. Maya, bless her oblivious honesty, kept going. "Your work saved our ethics review team months of headaches. You have no idea how many lawsuits you helped us avoid just by making the transparency modules public. We thought you were based in Europe." Reed Tech sounded like one of those Scandinavian think tanks. I almost laughed. "Nope," I said. "San Diego." Julia turned to Ethan with a mixture of confusion and something else, respect, maybe. Or suspicion. "Did you seriously not know?" she asked him. "You've never mentioned her work once." Ethan's mouth opened again, then closed. "I didn't." He looked at me, and for the first time I saw something crack beneath the polished veneer. Shame. Embarrassment. Maybe even regret. My mother cleared her throat then. It was soft, but deliberate. A signal that she was regaining composure. "Olivia," she said, her voice carefully measured, "why didn't you ever tell us about all this?" I tilted my head. "Would you have listened?" The question hung between us like a second chandelier, cold and heavy. She didn't answer. Across the table, my father adjusted his tie. The forced smile was back. "Well," he said, "we're glad to hear you've found your footing. Everyone does it in their own time." I almost smiled. Found your footing, as if the last decade had been some prolonged stumble instead of an intentional ascent. As if I had simply lucked into impact and recognition, rather than sacrificing sleep, security, and sanity to build something no one believed I could. "I didn't find anything," I said, my voice firm. "I built it." That silenced him. The server arrived with dessert then, some kind of lavender mousse with a sugared lattice, but no one touched it right away. The tension hadn't dissipated. It had only shifted, redistributed itself across the table like a sudden draft of cold air. Eventually, conversations resumed in small, awkward pockets. Someone asked Julia's father about a new investment fund. One of my cousins pulled out her phone and started scrolling. A younger guest down the table raised his eyebrows at me and mouthed, "Cool." I gave him a nod. But the axis of the evening had already tilted. And for once, I wasn't the ghost in the room. I was the axis. When dinner ended, I stood calmly, collected my coat, and declined offers of post-dinner drinks with a polite smile. Maya hugged me briefly and said, "Please tell me you're speaking at the next Tech Impact Summit. I'll actually attend this year if you are." "I am," I replied. And now I'll know at least one person in the crowd. Outside, the air was cool and clean, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I had to exhale my way back into myself. They hadn't welcomed me back. They hadn't apologized. But for a moment, they had been forced to see me. Not as the failure they'd quietly dismissed, but as the person I had always been becoming. And that was enough. They always assumed silence was shame. But silence can also be strategy. It can be safety. And sometimes, silence is just choosing not to shout for people who have already decided not to hear. I didn't touch my dessert. The lavender mousse sat untouched in its delicate crystal dish, the sugared lattice already beginning to sag into the chilled surface. Around me, the conversations had resumed, but they were thinner now, hesitant. I wasn't invisible anymore, but I wasn't embraced either. It was as though I had shifted into a different species of relative, less the forgotten disappointment and more the one you approach cautiously, like a high-voltage wire that might be grounded or might leave a mark you'll feel for weeks. A few extended family members tried to loop me into soft conversations about how the industry's really changing or all that AI stuff with clumsy, performative curiosity. A few others simply looked away, as if my presence now complicated a narrative they'd grown too comfortable retelling. It was Maya who remained genuinely warm. She leaned over again after the clatter of silverware died down, her expression still equal parts awe and delight. "Seriously, you're just going to disappear now? After this reveal of the year?" I gave her a small smile, the kind that acknowledged the humor without inviting more. "I have an early flight tomorrow," I said evenly. "I've got meetings in Seattle all day Monday." She exhaled through a laugh. "Power move. Total power move." I shrugged lightly. "Just life." Maya hugged me as I stood up, her gesture unguarded, her voice low in my ear. "For what it's worth, I've followed a lot of voices in this space, but yours actually made me want to change how I work." Those words lodged somewhere beneath my ribs, quiet, but anchoring. When I stepped back from the table, only a few people noticed. Ethan glanced up, his mouth opening slightly like he was going to speak, but I simply nodded and moved toward the coat check. My mother didn't move. My father looked as though he had just now started replaying the entire evening in his mind, frame by frame, trying to determine what the damage would be. I didn't wait for more polite nods or awkward compliments. I didn't wait for anyone to stand. I didn't explain, didn't smile too broadly, didn't perform gratitude for attention that had arrived far too late. Outside, the night air hit me with crisp finality. The doors of the venue closed behind me with the soft, soundless suction of an expensive place pretending not to eavesdrop. I stood for a moment under the golden light of the overhanging lamps, adjusting my coat, letting the weight of the evening settle into my bones like silt after a long storm. And then, for the first time in years, I exhaled fully. I didn't look back. Back at my hotel, I kicked off my heels and let the night strip away its edges. I washed my face slowly, methodically, as though shedding not just makeup but the residue of years spent trying to prove I belonged in places where the doors had always been cracked open just enough to pretend they weren't locked. I changed into soft cotton pajamas and climbed into the perfectly made bed, feeling the ache in my shoulders begin to release. The silence wasn't hostile now. It was just mine. Around 11:43 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was Ethan. "Ethan, why didn't you ever tell me?" The message blinked up at me like an open wound, clean, but raw. I stared at it for longer than I expected, the fingers of one hand curled against the screen. He sounded genuinely shaken. Maybe even hurt. But I wasn't going to soothe his discomfort. Not this time. Not after years of swallowing my own. I typed the only honest answer there was. "Me, you never asked." I didn't wait for a reply. I turned my phone face down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling, listening to the dull, rhythmic thud of my own heartbeat. There was no explosion. No breakdown. No long overdue confrontation. Just that one truth, too small to cause damage, too heavy to ignore. And yet, it was enough. For once, I didn't feel compelled to explain myself. I didn't feel the need to write a long message, weaving a decade of pain into a carefully edited paragraph. I didn't want to walk him through all the missed birthdays and ignored calls, the small dismissals disguised as concern, the subtle humiliations cloaked in family tradition. Because now he knew. Not everything. Not even close. But enough to realize the version of me they'd kept alive at family dinners and holidays and in their whispered conversations behind closed doors had never actually existed. I fell asleep not with satisfaction, but with release. A weight lifted, not because they had finally seen me, but because I no longer needed them to. The next morning, I boarded a 7:05 a.m. flight back to San Diego. I ordered black coffee and declined the breakfast muffin. I stared out the window as the clouds thickened beneath us, folding the city away in pale morning light. By the time the plane touched down, my inbox had already begun to fill: an investor update, a partnership inquiry from a European university, a calendar invite from my CTO. Real life. The one I had built quietly. Precisely. On my terms. No part of me wanted to call my parents. No part of me ached to tell them more, to soften the impact, to include them in the success they never earned the right to claim. Because even now, I knew what would happen. They'd try to reframe it. They'd say they always believed in me. That they were just giving me space. That they didn't want to pressure me. That if I'd only opened up more, they would have supported me fully. But I didn't need them to believe in me. I had done the believing myself, in the quiet hours when no one was clapping. In the nights spent coding in an overheated apartment. In the morning meetings where I was the only woman at the table, and the only person who didn't flinch when challenged. That was mine. It always had been. And now, no matter what stories they tried to tell at the next holiday dinner, there was at least one witness, one voice that had broken the silence loud enough to tilt the room. They buried my name for years. All it took was one person recognizing it to bring the whole lie crashing down.